Liminal horror as a concept has had such a grip on the imagination of young horror lovers for nearly a decade now, with the Backrooms being such a vivid genesis point for many. Whether we saw that original green text post years ago, or we saw the virality of Kane Parsons' web series and found ourselves drawn to these stories, videos, images, and sometimes video games that place us in these spaces without bound, left alone after clipping in with no way out and fearful of what lies ahead in this unknown isolation. And because of that unknown, there is the ability to project an infinite amount of terrors into the endless void before it swallows you whole. What was once a much more niche subgenre defined nearly by online spaces has now led to such a much more expansive recognition of how these elements have always existed in the world around us, whether we look at video games like Silent Hill, which video games as a whole are such a partial imaginative origin point for this concept, or in the case with this video here, as film has always in the past. And after waiting years with bated breath to see the Backrooms in theaters, and after hearing so many amazing things from my friends in LA and London who'd seen the film, it's here. It's incredible. I loved this movie, and there's some people who are very torn on the film being about nothing, or being meaningless, or just being boring, and yet others like myself find the film to be so incredibly profound, to find Kane Parsons to be the next Kiyoshi Kurosawa or David Lynch, and yes, that is setting him up for failure, but I do see these comparisons here. And yes, when I do talk about the film, there will be no spoilers at all. But in this grander conversation, I just want to talk about liminal spaces, because just the other day I saw Jason Blum of Blumhouse Productions ask on Twitter, what is the most terrifying liminal space? With images of gas stations cloaked in darkness, endless hallways underneath people's workspaces, abandoned malls, and movie theaters popping up in many of the examples of what we think of a liminal space. Even watching Backrooms in movie theaters, I took a picture of the corner of the movie theater I was watching it in and realized, hey, you could argue this is a liminal space. And when we look at all these examples, we can see these aesthetics that we call upon when we think about liminal horror. We think about this overwhelming dread that follows. And I think also when talking about liminal spaces, it's important that we in turn expand the definition of liminal horror. It is far more expansive than I think most people give credit. See, when we look at, for instance, some of these real life examples of liminal spaces, we do know that they have an endpoint or have limitations. We may be afraid of the endless nature of them, especially when their endlessness is so easy to convey outside of a still image. You're no longer limited by imagination, but technically, even in that original image of the Backrooms, there are limitations there. It is likely some type of furniture store or office that indeed has an ending, but we're left running wild with our imagination, leading to the idea of a liminal space or liminal horror being far more metaphysical than I think some people give credit. As some online have suggested, it is a feeling or emotion or state of being, when I would go as far as to say a liminal space being the absence or the state of being or feeling not real or isolated or stuck in the existential plane with no escape. When you Google this, it quite literally means to transition, to be in between, and I think there's so many spaces that feel that way, especially when we look at our everyday world. Thinking of the state of 2026 and thinking about the endless oil wars that we're still trapped in, or the palpable loneliness when feeling isolated due to the recent COVID-19 pandemic and lockdown, and some still feeling so detached when making friends or finding partners, or questioning the state of clean water and protecting your livelihood on a planet that is ravaged by climate crisis and AI data centers, and so many feel like they're in this state of powerlessness where they feel trapped by the powers that be and just wish that someone would spark some type of meaningful change. And when you stare at all that, it's all really easy all of a sudden to take in all that dread and find yourself in this liminal horror about the unknown, because it also is seen in our everyday, and it's easy to find some kind of catharsis just by engaging with some of it in a fictional way. And as I over the years have attempted to search for as many films exploring liminal horror or liminal spaces as I could, whether this was a few spare locations within a film or they shaped the entirety of the fabric of the film, I was shocked when I would stumble across recommendations from people of horror movies all throughout film history. I do think it's fair to distinguish that the definition of a film exploring liminal horror can be expansive, but when we see these narratives online, a decent number are first person or single location, but in film, we can all of a sudden have a singular liminal space as part of a greater familiar world, as we even see in the trailers for Backrooms. And typically these films are rarely first person, unless we're talking about found footage horror or movies that verge closer to analog horror or lo-fi horror, pulling us off into the past with few, if any, jump scares and with an experimental nature to their narrative. But when looking back at the examples of liminal horror that were shared with me, most were not all that shocking, like the 2001 film Session 9, which to me feels like one of the closest movies to capture the spiritual feeling of Silent Hill in film form, or The Shining, one of the most defining films of the genre and maybe the greatest Stephen King adaptation that is not a great adaptation. But then I started getting film recommendations that went way earlier than that, and I wondered, when looking at over 100 years of movies and watching over 50 350 movies total for this video. If liminal horror has always existed in film, how is it evolving, and not just how these liminal spaces in horror have taken form, but also where is this horror drawing upon in the world? Because despite how the world has changed, we're all still afraid of the unknown, we're still afraid of what's next, and really, can we find any escape from it, or will we be swallowed whole by these liminal spaces? My name is James, this is Movie Good or Movie Bad, and I deeply apologize for the delay here. Two of my cats have been very sick. One of them has started having seizures, the other needs heart medication. They're doing much better now, and I'm back. As someone who's been very informally exploring the world of liminal horror in film, I made a list that has well over 90 films that's available on my Letterboxd. Hey, this is James, you can check that out, and there's plenty of movies on there, including ones that I didn't cover, including some that I still haven't seen. They've been recommended all over to me by directors, actors, film programmers, really some of the most trusted voices online. As someone who's previewed almost 80 of them, these are some really outstanding pieces of gold right here. Seriously, if you want to check out liminal horror and expand your knowledge, stick around for this video and maybe check out some of the movies I mentioned here, or even some of the ones that didn't make this video, because my god, I'm not talking about 100 movies today. And of course, if you have more recommendations, share them in the comment section on Letterboxd or down below. And this video today is very unique. Obviously, I make video essays on here. I am very conscientious about how I approach this channel, and yet this video feels somewhere between a video essay and a list of recommendations. It is far more complex than just a list of recommendations. There's some analysis here. I'm breaking down some of these movies without giving spoilers, yet the form is going to be a bit looser than some might expect for this page, yet I do think there's a lot to grasp onto here, especially as we break down the different eras of horror that we're looking at. Really, I want to talk about some of the experimental liminal horror films. I want to talk about the blockbuster liminal horror films. I want to talk about some horror films from some directors that you know, where I think they just as a whole examine liminal spaces. And then really I want to bring us back to the present with these modern day liminal horror movies that you and I are probably familiar with, before we take some time to talk about the Backrooms. This was a titanic undertaking in so many different ways. I've been playing this video for maybe half a year now, so I really do hope people enjoy it. If not, that's okay too. If you do enjoy this video, please like, comment, subscribe, hit that bell. I am still trying to grow this page quite a bit, especially compared to some of my other social media platforms. You might have seen me on TikTok or Instagram or Letterboxd, where you can follow me in all those places, just the handles you see above. But if you haven't seen me before, I'd love to see you there. Currently on Instagram and TikTok, I'm doing a series where I'm covering 350 movies I wish more people talked about on social media, and giving a brand new movie recommendation every single day, and that's been a real blast. Either way, I thank you all for being here, and just remember, there is no definitive explanation for any of these spaces. I do not care much about the lore at all. Today I want to talk about what these spaces mean to me, what I draw from the connections, especially as I look at several decades of film, and really, what does our fascination with liminal spaces, before we even call them liminal spaces, say about us as a society? And before we get started with this, I do actually want to name, there was a horror movie that came up more and more as time went on, the earliest example of liminal horror that I could come across talking to anybody, so maybe let's actually start with 1921's The Phantom Carriage. Dickensian in nature, and that might be a broad understatement, The Phantom Carriage is a tale adapted from the 1912 Swedish novel by Selma Lagerlöf, Thy Soul Shall Bear Witness. The film follows David Holm, a drunk who passed away on New Year's Eve, and because he is the last person to die before the new year, is taken on death's chariot and is asked to become its rider in order to collect the souls of everyone who dies in the upcoming year. Immediately striking in form and atmosphere, lots of horror pre-70s, aside from the most well-known of classics, is just ignored, especially as I talk to most horror lovers, and really anything 50s or pre-50s can easily get ignored, including this classic. A tremendous influence on Ingmar Bergman, and really overwhelming in its melodrama, and I'll make this clear without making it obvious. Dickensian as a label is drawing a parallel to a very well-known story from the author about an older man getting what is coming to him through ghosts from the past. But while there's some limitations in form due to when The Phantom Carriage was released, with it should be explicitly named that film had largely existed as short films, and the first feature-length film was not made until 1906, and the oldest surviving feature film is Dante's Inferno, which was made in 1911. Film is still considered in its infancy as an art form in 2026, and certainly was back in 1921. And regardless of the magnificent detail and maybe the film's not all too shocking ending from a modern lens, you won't see what most young people imagine as a liminal space, but you will see a liminal nature in a man haunted by death, his body turned transparent as you wade in and out of the world through different periods of time, trying to grasp onto the humanity that you have. And it could be fair to describe this in a way that is similar to no clipping out of reality, being unbound by corporeal form and transitioning through space and time. There is a liminal nature to navigating this world without those physical limits, and in the film's case, and truly most liminal horror beyond this point, the horror is framed around death, and is existential in a manner that makes me me think of all the greatest fears that I think drew people to our modern understanding of what we call to be liminal horror, and really aren't we all afraid of no longer existing in this world? I want to talk real quickly about the idea of parallel creation, which I'm not sure what the technical term for this is, but the idea that two different people at two different points of time can create the same piece of art in two very different kinds of ways through two very different origin points. This is very different than a twin movie or the idea that, hey, I'm working at Pixar, I'm seeing you're making Bugs Life, I'm very upset that you're making Bugs Life, I'm going to go over here to DreamWorks and we're going to make Ants very, very quickly. That's not parallel creation, that's just rushing to create the same movie at another place in order to generate competition between studios. And certainly other twin movies throughout history are not shaped by corporate espionage or trying to get the upper hand or plagiarism. They're typically movies with generic enough ideas or coincidental enough ideas that, hey, they just kind of come out randomly at the same time. Something much more unique here has happened with Kane Parsons and the rest of the people making analog and liminal horror shorts on YouTube, because while it's very easy for some horror fans and those who don't take the platform of YouTube seriously to brush off the feats of the creators I mentioned before, I actually think about what's happening with the liminal horror scene on YouTube, and a lot of it actually shares a synchronicity with the experimental horror that I watched in preparation for this video that was being released in the 60s and 70s. Now, this parallel is entirely accidental, but to me, this only makes a much more profound connection, especially as we tackle some of these works and the similarities between them thematically. To create a trajectory through both the experimental works and more conventional fare that I'm tackling today, expect most of these segments to be chronological and broken down with the type of film that we're talking about, but I do actually want to start with this video of a long, winding, and endless hallway where, as we slowly meander at an uncomfortable pace before the world around us starts to warp and warble and we find ourselves trapped in an endless strobe, staring at a nude woman that we're trying to reach but can never touch. And to clarify, I will not be showing any of the strobing here, and for anybody with any type of light sensitivity, because it does reach a limit. It becomes very uncomfortable in this film. And many might find themselves confused watching this, but today in front of us is the 1970 23-minute short film, Corridor, directed by Standish Lauder, who is also one of the first human beings to ever be experimented on with psychedelics, including mescaline, LSD, and psilocybin, and then later, as part of getting his PhD in art history from Yale, would complete a thesis on how modern artists such as Picasso or Kandinsky were being influenced by film and vice versa. The end result of this instantly reminded me of Hideo Kojima's PT and being trapped in the endless hallway within the Silent Hill universe, but there's also a liminal nature to this space, a familiar aspect to its location as it appears to be any kind of hallway that you may see in your home or your apartment building, and you are trapped chasing this ghost that could be reflective of longing, whether this is someone that you have this deep relationship with or the fleeting thoughts of what could have been with a stranger. And this overwhelming dread is familiar through many of the other experimental shorts and features that came my way, whether they came out roughly at this time period or after, including the 1967 short film Wavelength. Directed by Michael Snow, this film uses a still camera during 3 different scenes with 3 different sets of characters and lets them all play out naturally without any cuts, including one where 2 people listen to Strawberry Fields Forever on the radio, another where a man dies randomly on the floor, and another about the owner of an apartment speaking calmly on the phone about the dead man in her apartment that she has never seen before. Many unfamiliar with experimental film may scoff at the fixed camera angles, lack of edits, and the use of liminal space when defining Wavelength, but really we're given a glimpse into the lives of a few without much context, but we're also engaging with a sensory experience that allows us to take on a voyeuristic stance that lets the horror of the situation seeping in let us be powerless to a singular gaze we cannot shake and then are pulled away from without any sense of control. In this case, the liminal space is singular, like Corridor, and we can project ourselves into any of these unshakable spaces that we're trapped in, but what happens when we give these spaces more room for character? The 1976 film The Animal, directed by Walter Ungerer, a film that I came across in a thread from I Saw the TV Glow Jane Schoenbrunn searching for liminal horror films, and a movie currently sitting at less than 700 watches on Letterboxd at the time of writing this video. It is a film following a man and a woman, presumably a couple, at a deserted train station in New England during the winter with blankets of snow on the ground, as they spend an undisclosed amount of time in a cabin in the woods alone and are watched by 2 children who don't make a single word and an old woman. It is a frightening picture defined by its silence, its lack of explanation, which leaves an immediate impression even if some people find themselves struggling with no clarity from the picture. To me, while it's easy to see this endless winter wonderland and view this as a liminal space, it also further amplified by this overwhelming quiet. the distance not only from society these two are experiencing, but also how the camera keeps its distance from this couple and how these children exist as voyeurs, for the conflict driving a wedge, pulling us even further back than a still image might when you think about this initial premise. A broad sense of character may be controversial for some when talking about liminal horror, but even in some of the examples I really love from 80s horror, including highway hypnosis and landscape, replace the second word with another word used to choose to take your own life, because that word's censored here. Sorry. The former is a shot-on-video horror film or a movie shot on a handheld camera that is typically similar in quality to what you or I or your parents would have filmed on their cameras when they were just filming a soccer game or filming a family event, which often adds a layer of authenticity and life to the picture that is really hard to shake, and as a film I actually won't spoil because it features a man simply driving down the long, winding highways of the United States before a violent truth is revealed about who this man is. We found ourselves driving along these never-ending highways, sprawling from place to place. America in turn becomes this giant liminal space based on the reality of this country's geography and what this country is at its fabric, which is violent in its underbelly. While there is a sense of character grounding our perspective in the film, having the knowledge of an individual like this roaming the highways of this country some of us live in leaves a pit in the stomach. It's easily a film that could be carried by its aesthetic or concept, but becomes one of the most subversive queer films I've ever seen. Now, an oddball predating the modern liminal horror genre that most of us think of is this landscape film released in 1986, a film detailing the stories of two American criminals, Ed Gein, a Wisconsin farmer that is more commonly known by true crime enthusiasts as the Butcher of Plainfield, whose collection of human body parts supposedly made him an inspiration for some other criminals, and Bernadette Pratt, who is a California teenager who got into an argument with her friend after being insulted and took her friend's life at just 16 years old. The film is a faux documentary, sometimes labeled as an actual documentary that at times shares a synergy with highway hypnosis, focusing on how violence has shaped the United States into a liminal space and poisoned the ground around it. But I think instead of these sprawling, endless, and sometimes empty hallways transforming the United States into a liminal space that we expect from highway hypnosis, we have this inversion here where we focus on largely two extended scenes of these two violent people presented in the least tantalizing or exciting way. It honestly feels like the polar opposite of what you might expect from a true crime film or TV show, or the ways that people view or engage with it in their everyday lives. It makes it all the more perverse to sit in the violence surrounding these two people. To view a film so sterile may disinterest some, but there is a cerebral nature to what is liminal here, making us be unable to escape the violence surrounding the events of the film, which makes it challenging to stare into. Although a very different extension of this idea, The Black Tower, a 1987 short film, draws upon a similar existential feeling, and while the vast majority of reviews on a website like Letterboxd, including my own, pull upon the film being more connected to the creepypasta stories many of us have grown familiar with on our time on the internet, there's an entirely liminal nature to the film. An ever-present Black Tower follows us around on every corner of a map, drawing all the more close, consuming you and trapping you inside of it, making for a liminal horror based around architecture and urbanization, and finding yourself swallowed whole, not necessarily creating or perpetuating this fear around cities. I've lived in Baltimore the last 9 years, I've seen what Fox News has said about the city, but there is a dread about how liminality spreads, leading to a unique experience where not only is there a space where you or I see where it's drawing upon the haunting or the existential, but there's also a world that is becoming more terrifying as time goes on because it is becoming more liminal as time goes on. It's clear from a few examples I've given that liminal horror can exist in any space at any time, but can we also make a space more liminal as well as the lens we view it? In a post-9/11 world, we've entered a surveillance state that we've never been able to escape. Big Brother exists in a way that is larger than ever conceived in fiction. It drives the populace insane to lose that level of freedom, and in order not to be here, we are surrounded by darkness, usually only lit by a lone light or thermal footage, our ears flooded with calls on police scanners of crime in your area. There is an inescapable reach, especially noticed in the extended finale of the film, where suddenly the camera takes on a much more active role and perpetuating the very real idea that we have nowhere to escape in any of this. Horror in the suburb has always taken on a role in the public consciousness. It's why the opening scene of Get Out strikes such fear in most people. It's why Nightmare on Elm Street having Freddy Krueger come for the people in their homes causes so much fear, and to expand that to every home in every inch of America makes an inescapable feeling so definitive of the genre. And I think once this feeling sinks into our homes, we should also talk about how this horror is part of the everyday. It is rooted in the same critique of the suburb that you might see in a John Waters movie like Polyester or Serial Mom, which is that American life and how it is shown perfected through the American family is wildly imperfect. No one should be held to these gender roles ideals and expectations. Not everybody has an aspiration for that type of life, and nobody wants to be caught up in the mundanity of it all. And it can be argued that that mundane nature creates a liminalness and the existential dread of being caught in a dead-end job with no way out. It's why a film like Hotel, which was released in 2004, almost feels comical in premise when exploring a hotel receptionist who learns the woman she replaced disappeared without a trace. And truly, the film blends the horrors of the supernatural, the unknown, and a job that leaves you trapped, further creating evidence of the state of mind that allows you to enter a liminal space. And maybe this should bring us to our other liminal horror film that is a bit more mainstream about hotels. Conceptually, when growing my understanding of liminal spaces, I found myself most shocked to see the occasional mainstream major studio film appearing on these lists, most often with The Shining being named, and gazing upon the unique pattern of the carpets of the Overlook Hotel, a mix of neutral and pastel colors adorning the walls, and a unique architecture that creates such a distinct look while also being empty, reminding us of the past, and being overwhelming in scale and filled with the ghost of those who once visited the remote attraction that somehow has a labyrinth of hedges just outside the confines of the hotel that seems so much larger on the inside than the outside. Now, some of the choices about the mechanics of these liminal spaces are just cinematic, or to add to the terror that Jack Torrance and his family experience are just choices that many films make around the lack of logic, framing a space in order to make it work better for a film. A great example of this is looking at the final showdown in the first Scream film, looking phenomenal as one of the best in horror, but when Neve Campbell Sidney is going from room to room, she's not actually traversing the home from the film as you normally would if you were to walk into it now in real life, with us jumping from room to room in a way that feels absolutely nonsensical if you were to look at a blueprint of the building. But we question the logic of this less because there is a seamless edit, the frantic nature of the frights in these moments making up only a small part of the film, whereas in The Shining, there is an overwhelming existential dread that makes up the entire slow burn of the film, and you lose yourself in this space as Jack Torrance sadly loses himself to alcoholism and is warped by the space in a profoundly sad way. And while the liminal nature here is as physical as it is mental, The Shining's prominence in the horror genre and the level of inspiration past its release means that other films in the mainstream can take on more liminal qualities if they're just inspired by this film, regardless if that type of inspiration is intentional. Another popular film that came to mind when exploring liminal spaces in horror was the film Jacob's Ladder, which, while known to many horror fans in their mid-20s and above, I do want to keep vague about the nature of the film as to not spoil its twist, therefore some of its liminal qualities are a little vague here. But the film follows Jacob Singer, played by Tim Robbins, a Vietnam War vet who finds himself suddenly in a Lovecraftian tale after going to the chiropractor, being adjusted, and suddenly finding himself temporarily transported into a nightmare world. And this existential nature to what this man is experiencing contributes to how the world literally forms around us. And if it wasn't already known, this film is one of the most influential on the development of the Silent Hill series, especially when looking at early games of the series, with some fans believing some moments to have been directly carried over from film to movie. But sadly, due to the lack of the availability of the Silent Hill video games on modern consoles, I will just have to take your word for it. An odd way to describe the film, but one of the most notable mainstream liminal horror films to me is arguably the most famous found footage film of them all, The Blair Witch Project. It's hard for a modern audience to take for granted, as I did the majority of my life watching this film, but I think the liminal nature of the film extends beyond these three documentarians getting lost and disappearing in the woods, but it also exists within the meta nature of the film and the level of believability around its narrative, because these young actors were forced to pretend to go missing. Members of their family questioned where they were and were looking for them. They were not allowed to seek out other work as if they were missing, and it convinced people not only that the film was horrifying, but also instead of a fake documentary, it was indeed a real documentary. And for those of you who are not aware, the film in the state most of you have seen it in is not actually the actual presentation of the film. The boutique Blu-ray label Second Sight, based out of the United Kingdom, released an edition of the film that restores the film to its original look as a shot-on-video horror film, which was originally shot with a camcorder using high 8 recording tapes, filming the movie in 8mm in color, and then shooting separately in 16mm for the black and white portions of the film. And while I can't speak to the original theatrical release, any home video release, or any digital release of the film has never quite looked like this in my opinion, and only adds to the level of realism that adds on to the alternate reality game that made people so scared when the film was initially released. And those Maryland woods have kept the imagination of so many people, especially when seeing Heather and her friends go off on the innocuous adventure that they do, only to find themselves lost, running around in circles, swarming into this witch's den, which also doesn't bring into question how people can interpret the events of the film as supernatural or not supernatural. Although I view the majority of liminal spaces as existential, the Blair Witch projects may be too literal, whether we're looking into the woods or the home of the witch, or maybe it's based around the mistrust or paranoia that causes you to question the world around you, which again transforms the world into a liminal space, but in a very limited form, with the existential weight being more limited than the majority of films we're speaking on. Sitting somewhere between obscure and mainstream for your everyday viewer, I felt the need to name both David Lynch and Kiyoshi Kurosawa when thinking about directors who made a notable number of horror films defined by an expansive look at a liminal space, although the former is far more well known, either through Twin Peaks or many of his films regardless if he is named in connection with them, although we might be able to say the same with Kurosawa's Pulse or Cure in the modern day with film buffs. With David Lynch, we can find ourselves walking along that zigzag floor and the red velvety curtains of the Black Lodge, or barreling down the dark highways of an endless road, or finding yourself in a space without any sense or reason confronting this dark underbelly of the Americana that David Lynch found so much to critique within, while also recognizing so much beauty in the world around us, and that the greatest evil was often found within our homes, with Leland Palmer being the most notable example. And I've talked about David Lynch before on my channel after his passing, and I talked about this overwhelming humanism in the majority of his works, allowing us to project ourselves onto many of his complex leads and side characters. But I think in the case of liminal spaces in his work, there's an application of dream logic, which for those that are unfamiliar, think about the lack of logic of the dreams that you may have. Finding yourself talking to someone in a car from the back seat and suddenly realizing no one has a hold of the wheel and no one else is in the car, or finding yourself paralyzed when staring outside your window in the third floor apartment you live in and seeing someone trying to get in from the outside with no scaffolding to climb up onto, or finding yourself swallowed by darkness with no sense of bearings as you just left to wait in the emptiness. And suddenly, if you can imagine this, you can make more sense of the endless void that you can imagine from Eraserhead, or some of the lack of narrative sense by the third act of Mulholland Drive, or the most abstract bits of Twin Peaks, which in turn not only makes these liminal spaces that feel so distinct in appearance in a David Lynch world, but because of the lack of logic compared to the everyday world, the liminal quality becomes based around the dream, or in many cases the nightmares that take shape of our world. In Eraserhead, there's a direct fear about the potential failure of being a father. In Twin Peaks, there's the inability to escape the horrors of the entire world. In Lost Highway, it's about the liminal space of these endless highways as a stranger invades your home, and in all of these works, there's a complete loss of self because of all of this. While functioning differently and evoking a different type of dread than David Lynch, I've always perceived Kiyoshi Kurosawa's works being about the grand and unspeakable evil of the world that is at times entirely random, and also leads to a structuring of his films that leads to an isolation and loneliness that feels at times implied to be existing far after his stories end for us. Whether we speak about Cure, where we follow a police detective who is investigating a series of seemingly unrelated crimes, where an individual takes the life of another seemingly with no cause, but there's a giant X found on the wall near each crime, and the film takes an unexpected and disturbing turn, or Pulse, a film where we stare into the disconnected world existing in the birth of our relationship to the internet, where the dead are rising, we lose even more of ourselves than we knew we could, or in Seance, a film featuring a husband and a psychic wife as they attempt to solve a missing girl case, and it goes horribly wrong. Kiyoshi Kurosawa understands the power of the imagination running wild. As the horrors of the world never really disappear, he stares into a world that makes itself as liminal as David Lynch's by merely existing, and whether basing yourself in a liminal world without the logic that we expect from our world or relying on the imagination around the unknown, I don't think it's a stretch to say that there's an influence on David Lynch and Kiyoshi Kurosawa in the modern works of liminal horror that have captured our imagination, especially with that of Kane Parsons and his film Backrooms. And now, the entire history of liminal horror has brought us here to the present. Even if these films did not directly inspire one another, even if these filmmakers were not aware of each other, we could all find ourselves gripped by these spaces that capture the collective horrors of a world that was disconnected, adjacent to the one that was promised, a future that seems hopeless, especially when looking again at how the COVID-19 pandemic and lockdown shaped the world. There's a collective reckoning with what could have been and the horrors of what was, and similarly to the connective tissue that is liminal horror as a vast subgenre of horror being accidental, whether we're talking about the terrors of the liminal horror films made post-COVID or pre-COVID, it's so easy for us to project so many of our feelings about COVID onto them. For instance, we can look at Robert Eggers' 2019 film The Lighthouse, see Willem Dafoe and Robert Pattinson both as lighthouse keepers stranded on their outpost, equally at each other's necks and bathing in homoeroticism, lost in a world where their connection to time is so loose and their tension has to erupt at some point. The lighthouse and its surrounding area get swept by waves, and there is is an argument for the same liminal space extending to the mysticism surrounding reaching the top of this lighthouse and discovering what is inside, but also parallels with the mystery surrounding what is driving Pattinson's character and what is he hiding from that is leading to an isolation greater than he hoped. And I think hiding from yourself shapes so many of these modern liminal spaces in horror for me, like watching the adaptation of I'm Thinking of Ending Things, a film that I'm not afraid to say is going to get a far more extended video and an essay coming up later this month from me. As a woman is traveling with her boyfriend to a family dinner, we're trapped on this endless road with these two characters monologuing at each other, stuck in this singular vehicle with overlapping trains of thought, allowing for very few characters to breathe. The physical nature of this journey will stick out to many as liminal, but also so will the end and the meaning and interpretation of everything that comes. Many will have watched this film without understanding its final few moments with its dance sequence in the snow, but when thinking about the film as a companion piece to that original novel, it becomes quite clear how liminal what could have been was. And yes, that is ambiguous, and yes, you should just read the novel and watch the movie and get what I mean. We also couldn't talk about modern liminal horror without also speaking on the masterpiece of analog horror that is Skinamarink, which I firmly believe its leak online after a festival appearance and box office performance following that is why we're seeing films like Backrooms on the big screen, and why the former film's director Kyle Edward Ball has his next film, The Land of Nod, at A24. I was so struck by how many people saw Skinamarink in a dark theater filled with largely strangers immersed in the claustrophobic sound of two children waking up in the middle of the night with their father missing and every window and door to their home was gone, and hear the static of emptiness staring into an empty face with no features, being pressed up against the corner of each wall, not knowing what is behind you or what lurks behind every corner, as we see two kids ultimately live inside the dark nightmare that is a childhood home where your worst memories were formed, whether you view this as someone staring back into the past of their childhood home or you buy into the theory that this is a film about a young child fading away into nothingness. And there were people who saw this and said the film means nothing, which is wild, making the entire home a liminal space sitting just outside the exact details that make up the many structures traps you in a living nightmare that has more in common with David Lynch than I fear most would give credit. Another filmmaker that draws a lot of comparisons to Lynch for a good reason is Jane Schoenbrunn, and whether we're talking about their debut film We're All Going to the World's Fair, featuring a young girl partaking in the fictional online World's Fair challenge, and she starts to question if any of her reality is real, and I Saw the TV Glow, the much more well-known film which follows Owen as he gets to know his classmate Maddie through their shared love of the TV show The Pink Opaque, and questions begin to form if the TV show is real or actually their lives. When looking at Jane Schoenbrunn's first two works, we have characters who find themselves lost in the fiction and media that they're engaging with as it shapes their personhood, world, and gender, and in so many ways, this is true the experiences of so many when thinking about their own relationship to art that they love. And while there are many instances where scenes become otherworldly, such as Owen seeing Maddie in the empty grocery store in the evening, one could argue that their entire being and gender becomes liminal in the same ways as the media that they consume. Liminal quite literally means the state in between or transitioning, and what better application of that is to apply it to some horror films about being transgender. And maybe most recently, Exit 8 should be briefly mentioned in this conversation, closing the gap between video games inspiring modern liminal spaces, inspiring other video games, inspiring movies, which remind you all the other liminal spaces in horror I mentioned before, and Exit 8 is pretty good. People should see it as it takes on a far more existential turn than the original video game ever had, which had no narrative. And now we're here with Backrooms, Kane Parsons' feature-length directorial debut that, since playing in theaters the last 2 weeks, has already shattered box office records, immediately opening with A24's highest domestic and international box office weekends, and also, I believe, as of today, has become A24's highest-grossing film of all time. I know that for many who are stumbling across this video and making it to this final portion, they're expecting a full video essay on the film, but I do still want to limit spoilers in the events that someone is working themselves up to watching this movie. Backrooms takes place in 1990 as we follow Chiwetel Ejiofor's Clark, a man struggling with his divorce, running a furniture store who engages most often with his therapist Mary, played by Renata Reinsva, who discovers the pale yellow wallpaper-lined endless hallways and rooms that we all know to be the backrooms underneath his furniture store. And the film blew me away with so many of its metrics. Kane Parsons calls upon an immense dread that never let me go, finding us stuck stuck in these rooms alongside our main characters with such a focus on these spaces being one that echoes our own memories inconsistently and causes our own psyche to shape the space. Renata Reinsva is great, but Chiwetel Ejiofor gives what I think is his best performance in years, existing within a man that is so sad and lonely and angry, losing himself to his capitalistic pursuits of a store that is failing with no customers and being unable to adapt to the point of where he loses his marriage and these spaces take on so much of his person, with the furniture store being the focal point of what the Backrooms begins to look like, as we begin to literally see warped versions of the furniture in his store take shape in this liminal space. Sharing an interpretation without context is a choice in my part, but I feel that Backrooms is the perfect endpoint and loop for this circle and journey that I found myself on when looking at 100 years of liminal horror and film, because not only have those spaces become liminal, so have we. Every aspect of ourselves is in transition, making way for change, adapting to whether we want it to or not. And in the case of Ejiofor's Clark, he's a man who's begun to lose himself to the pain of his marriage, and whether you view the shape of the Backrooms to be reflective of his own dark drive or amplifying those worst qualities, Clark becomes liminal in the space, where in my mind the space is not just remembering him, it is becoming him. He is the Backrooms, and while I'm not sure how any of this will take shape in future installments from Kane Parsons, whether on YouTube or in television or film, Clark has left an imprint in this space which has allowed them to warp into each other because he has such little desire to change and really allows for such a smart evolution of the mythology that Kane has built. Truly one of the most impressive debuts in horror in recent years, and while my interpretation is far out there, losing yourself to a capitalistic drive that comes from the American dream can only lead to the same form of existential horror that shapes every single one of the liminal spaces I mentioned before. But the liminal space becomes fully realized as it consumes Clark's personhood, and really isn't that the greatest fear of any of these liminal spaces. They reflect back on the horrors of the world 100-fold, provide some level of catharsis as we're not alone in this experience, but we see how the world changes it. It feels like we're on an inevitable timetable that is accelerating to the point of no escape, making us just like Clark as we're lost in the liminal space of the world and transforming us to our worst versions because of it. And now I am just left with an empty feeling grasping the history of the films before the Backrooms and recognizing that the worst fears shaping this horror have always been true, and the walls are closing in, and we're left alone as the windows and the doors to the world disappear, and we wait for the end as we're lost in the maze of our minds. Or, maybe these movies are just all mid and boring, and maybe I'm just looking too deep into these spaces that have no meaning. Either way, thank you all for being here. Thank you for sitting with this very odd video essay where I grappled with my own existence. If you did enjoy this, please like, comment, subscribe, comment down below. James, what the hell did you just make right here? If you enjoyed this, I hope to see you all next time.